Support for St. Louis Public Radio comes from The Rep, kicking off its new season with Dial M for Murder. High suspense unravels on the Rep stage as a murder plot spirals into chaos. Dial M for Murder opens September 18th. Tickets at repstl.org.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the program, we'll talk with a group of students from MICDS about how they're approaching the upcoming presidential election. We'll also speak with a historian about the tradition and controversy around nepotism in American politics. First, Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris and her GOP presidential rival Donald Trump will square off in a debate next Tuesday in Philadelphia. This showdown of commander-in-chief aspirants brings to mind how Washington University hosted a number of memorable debates for more than 30 years. Longtime St. Louis political reporter Jo Mannies is here with me. Jo, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Well, thanks for having me.
You have attended a number of Washington University debates alluded to in the introduction. Can you kind of describe the atmosphere of these events?
Well, the early ones, actually, I attended every one of them but one. So the early ones tended to have more of almost like a circus atmosphere. The 1992 one, Clinton had a big thing outside after the debate, and Bush, this is the Bush one, had rented the old arena, which is now no more, and had a huge crowd there to watch the debate with a giant TV screen. And Lee Greenwood, first time he sang that, "God Bless the USA."
Yeah, I proud to be an American.
Yes,
etc.
So my point is that this whole atmosphere, if you were in the vicinity, almost overtook what was happening inside the debate hall, because it was just kind of a joyous, at least they were trying to present that atmosphere. It was very different from what then went on in some of the other debates where it became more serious. The 2000 debate had to be moved to a day later because it was scheduled on a Tuesday. Then Governor Mel Carnahan, his son, and a top aide were killed in the plane crash the night before. And so out of respect, the debate was moved a day. I was supposed to be one of the writers on that debate. I was actually covering the Carnahan tragedy, so the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had to move some other people in to do it. So that one had a very somber atmosphere, the 2001, which was between Gore and Bush II.
Which we'll talk about later in the show. But I had a chance to talk with former Washington University Chancellor Mark Wrighton on Thursday, and he told me that having debates throughout the years at his university was a long-term boon.
I would say that there were tangible benefits. The reason I say that is when recruited students, we often were asked, are you going to host a presidential debate when I'm there? And it was a great interest. And many people who were on campus were able to actually go to the debate and see the candidates live. And that was very interesting for those students who could attend.
That is former Washington University Chancellor Mark Wrighton speaking with me on Thursday. So I had a chance to go with you to the 2016 presidential debate. And
our last
one. And look, I'm not a WashU apologist, even though my wife is employed there and I work there as an adjunct instructor, for full disclosure. But the staff did an incredible job of accommodating the media, political figures, and the candidates. But I also know this didn't just happen magically. It takes a lot of work to get this done. What were your impressions about how that particular debate in 2016 was executed?
Well, all of the WashU debates, of course, I'm a little biased, but I was there for most of them, were very well organized. And the 2016 debate, they had to take into account, by then you're starting to have bloggers, other people other than just TV, radio, and print. So if you remember, they set up all these cubicles. There was things they did to try to, because the media environment had changed. Now, the big thing that I remember about that debate was we were both at our writing stations, and we were sending audio into the radio station here. And that was the one where there was the giant screen. And during one response by Hillary Clinton, Trump had moved, so he was like right behind her. It was kind of like on TV, it looked like it was a stalker thing, and he was going to do something. Well, he didn't do anything, but people still talk about that one.
Oh yeah, and personally, I found this debate to be lacking for one big reason. The moderators did not ask one question about overhauling criminal justice policy, even though Ferguson was literally like 10 miles away. But it did feature this line that may be a bit ironic given Trump's legal predicaments.
You know, it's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Yeah, because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
That was Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump at the 2016 debate at Washington University. Now, that memorable clip aside, do you agree with my prior statement that you found the overall debate to be lackluster?
Well, it's hard to tell. There was some unusual episode. This is the one where Trump brought in several women who had accused Bill Clinton of sexual assault years earlier to sit near in the front so Hillary would see them, and he did that because that Access Hollywood tape that made Trump look bad regarding women had just come out like a day or two before. So there was a lot of theatrics, I would say. You know, it was unusual.
It was, but I want to go back to the 1992 debate. It was notable for a number of reasons. First of all, Washington University had to put it together very quickly, I believe in 9 or 10 days.
Yes, it was very close.
And it also was notable because it not only featured President George H.W. Bush and Democratic challenger Bill Clinton, but it also included independent candidate Ross Perot. Here's audio of Perot from the October 1992 debate.
The principal issue that separates me is that 5.5 million people came together on their own and put me on the ballot. I was not put on the ballot by either of the two parties. I was not put on the ballot by any PAC money, by any foreign lobbyist money, by any special interest money. This is a movement that came from the people. This is the way the framers of the Constitution intended our government to be, a government that comes from the people.
That was Ross Perot, who ran for president in 1992 and 1996. How did the addition of Perot in this debate change how Clinton and Bush were able to act?
Well, Perot's focus was on the budget deficit and the debt, the national debt. So he had all these charts. Now they don't allow that.
No, he did not bring charts to the debate, but I do remember those were in infomercials.
But he had that infomercial that ran before. That's my point. During the debate, obviously, he didn't. But the point was that I think that's one of the reasons that debate, and to a lesser degree, the ones in 96, focused a lot more on budget issues and financial issues than some of the other issues that Clinton in particular wanted to talk about. Although by 96, Clinton was the incumbent, so it was very different. Now, as you and I know, Clinton had backed out of the WashU debate in 1996, so WashU ended up not hosting one, although I have the T-shirt that they made that they gave out to the press, because this cancellation was just shortly before. So I still have that, and that's supposed to be a collector's item because it's the debate that was never held.
Well, that is almost as much of a collector's item as the Kit Bond 2010 coffee mug that I received at a Lincoln Days. He did not run in 2010. Unfortunately, that mug is now in a landfill somewhere. So, yeah, there was no debate in 1996, but there was one in 2000, and it was a town hall style. And just as we had talked about Trump looming over Hillary Clinton, it featured this uncomfortable moment between George W. Bush and Al Gore.
That's what the question in this campaign is about. It's not only what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done? And I believe I can.
All right. What about the Dingell-Norwood bill?
That was George W. Bush and Al Gore in the 2000 presidential debate at Washington University. Now, obviously, that was an audio clip. Our listeners cannot see what happened, but to describe the scene, George W. Bush was speaking, and then Al Gore came up right behind him. George W. Bush turns to him, nods, and then that exchange occurs again. I don't think that exchange really helped Gore's chances, and it kind of played into this idea that he was like unsettling in these debates. What was your memories of the 2000s debate, besides the fact that it happened so soon after Governor Carnahan's death?
Well, with Al Gore, one of the issues had been, I think Gore was trying to focus in the 2000 debates also on financial issues, but like he was calling for a lockbox to protect Social Security and Medicare, and that became like one of his themes. And the fact that during the debate, especially the first one, Gore, this has to do with the mic. The mic was on, and he was heavily sighing during Bush's answers because he thought some of Bush's answers were inadequate. Well, initially, the news. This is from the WashU debate, where the initial press reaction was that Gore had done better than Bush, but within a couple days, all of a sudden was focused on the size and some of the other stuff, and all of a sudden it was making Gore look bad, not good. And that debate, I think, is a perfect illustration of how sentiment can change on who did the strongest performance from the immediate aftermath to a few days later when things settle and when the pundits and the analysts and the consultants and the allies and opponents start weighing in. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is during these debates, there's a crowd of these guys that are all around the reporters while you're sitting at your desk trying to do your work and watch the debate on the big screen, or you're in the debate hall, and you've got all these influencers around trying to tell you who did well and who didn't. That kind of adds to the circus atmosphere. And of course, that's where I met John Oliver in 2008.
Well, we need to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with political reporter Jo Mannies about the history of presidential debates in St. Louis. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. We now return to our discussion with political reporter Jo Mannies about how Washington University became a mainstay of presidential debates. Okay, you mentioned John Oliver and meeting him. Can you talk a little bit more about that, because that piqued my interest?
Okay, now this was during the 2008 debate, which was the vice presidential one between Sarah Palin and Joe Biden. And actually, that one ended up being the most watched debate of the ones that WashU hosted. Up until 2016. The 2016 debate actually ended up with the biggest TV audience of the WashU ones. But until then, it was 2008. Well, 2008, again, Sarah Palin, everyone was fixated on her. The whole speculation was how well Biden would do. Spoiler alert, he did really great and sort of really weakened the McCain-Palin ticket. Well, to illustrate the circus atmosphere, The Daily Show, which was then at its peak with Jon Stewart, the host, and all that, they had a full cadre there. And John Oliver, who now has his own show, was one of the correspondents. Well, I'm sitting at my desk getting ready to get things together and start this, because I'm supposed to be the chief writer on this one for the Post-Dispatch. And John Oliver slides a chair next to me and says, "Now just keep doing what you're doing, but I'm going to do a bit." This is as the debate's starting. So I'm trying to pay attention to what's being said, and then there's a comedian next to me who's saying stuff, just not to me, but just saying stuff. And it ended up being, I guess, one of my highlights of covering debates, because eventually I did see their clip. Of course, they condensed it, just a few seconds. But you do see me next to him typing away, because he kept telling me, keep typing, keep typing.
Well,
it's like, yes, I'm trying
that is quite a story. And I look at what John Oliver is now. It's clearly because he sat next to you at a debate, Joe.
Hardly.
So Washington University did not end up vying for a debate in 2020, and the Commission on Presidential Debates aren't handling debates this time around. That means they're no longer the political extravaganzas we know and love. I asked Wrighton if he thought Washington University would ever host a debate again. Here's what he said.
I would like to think that Washington University will grow in prominence and be a place which would attract all of the candidates who run for president. I think our students and faculty would be engaged, and the community here in St. Louis has a very keen interest in politics, and I believe that the university should consider hosting another debate in the future. Chancellor Martin was perhaps predicting the pandemic. It would have been extremely difficult to host a presidential debate in the fall of 2020. And I think as time unfolds, perhaps the opportunities will present themselves again.
That is former Washington University Chancellor Mark Wrighton speaking with me yesterday. Joe, do you think we'll ever see another presidential debate in St. Louis?
I would be surprised, but it has nothing to do with St. Louis, but I think it has more to do with just what's happening with debates. The circus atmosphere, several hundred people in the audience, all this stuff going on. All of that has gone by the wayside. The debates in this year, the first one with Biden and Trump in June, and now the one that's coming up next week, there's going to be no audience. There's not going to be this circus atmosphere around it. And it's going to be more like the 1960 debate between Nixon and Kennedy, which also had no major audience. And so I think in some ways part of it's cost, because it's so costly to put on the events like what WashU was hosting, which were maybe fun for reporters and interesting for the people involved.
Apparently they cost around $7 million. So
right.
This was expensive. And the other thing, too, is the candidates don't even need the Commission on Presidential Debates. They're just working with TV networks now, which also kind of changes the dynamics of this entire situation.
Well, that's somewhat like the 80s a little bit. And, the whole thing with Reagan and stuff and how those debates were held. They tried to make them more organized, and you had the commission and all that really ran things in the 90s and the 2000s. But I'm not sure that that's going to happen anymore. Yeah. I really don't.
It'll be interesting. I mean, debates are really important. They may have fallen out of vogue here in Missouri because we haven't had many for state level races as much as we have. But I'm looking forward to seeing what happens on Tuesday night. It could be a real decisive moment for our country and for the history of presidential debates. Well, Jo Mannies is a veteran political reporter who worked for St. Louis Public Radio, the St. Louis Beacon, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Jo, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
When we come back, we'll hear from some local high school students about their thoughts on the election and American politics, and we'll talk with a historian about how nepotism played a role in American politics and governance. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. In a moment, we'll talk about the enduring controversy over familial ties in American politics. But before that, I want to talk about one of my favorite parts of being a reporter at St. Louis Public Radio, talking to high school and college students about journalism. Yesterday, I joined State Representatives Ian Mackey and Jim Murphy at MICDS in Ladue to discuss the ups and downs of my profession and some of the major challenges confronting Missouri and St. Louis. This robust discussion was invigorating. MICDS students always come to these events with incisive questions that challenge even the most hardened journalist or politician. And what was even more heartening for me was the opportunity to talk with some of the MICDS students after the panel discussion ended.
I'm Alyssa Harris. I'm a senior at MICDS, and I'm from Florissant, Missouri.
I'm Zach Kravonek. I'm a senior at MICDS, and I'm from Clayton, Missouri.
I'm Reagan Hamilton. I'm a senior at MICDS, and I'm from St. Charles, Missouri.
Hi, I'm Claire Jokas. I am a senior at MICDS, and I am from Des Peres, Missouri.
I had the honor of talking with those four students about the upcoming presidential election between Democrat Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump. The conversation was earnest and freewheeling, and even though none of the students at the non-sectarian private school will be old enough to vote on November 5th, they're paying really close attention to this election. Reagan pointed out how much of an impact the race will have on their future.
This election is definitely a turning point and a pivotal election in our lifetimes, and for that reason, it definitely will be one that is memorable for us.
All four told me they're approaching this election with a mixture of apprehension and nerves. They were also relieved that they're not getting a rematch of the 2020 presidential race between Trump and President Joe Biden. But Claire said the unprecedented way in which the Harris-Trump matchup came about not only brought some excitement, but also sadness.
I think that Kamala is definitely the stronger pick, and I think that she's younger, she brings new perspective, and I think that he was really facing issues with being older, and I think she is a stronger candidate for the Democratic Party, but at the same time, he's done a lot for this nation and the Democratic Party in general, so it was a little bit of a bittersweet moment.
One of my key takeaways from chatting with these students is they're able to focus on more than just a singular issue. They're worried about the cost of consumer goods and higher education, as well as the future of abortion rights and the course of American foreign policy. In fact, Alyssa showcased that their concern about the future cannot be stuffed into some rigid ideological box.
With all the inflation, I feel like things are barely affordable anymore. I mean, I go to Target and I spend like $30 on 3 things now. I feel like it's kind of getting out of control, but I also definitely want to see more done with women's rights. I want to see how they're going to handle the topic of abortion. I want to see how they're going to handle things like the pay gap and things like that still continue for women and are still hardships for women in this country.
But perhaps the most thought-provoking comment came from Zach, who mentioned his exasperation over yet another deadly school shooting that occurred earlier this week in Georgia.
Yet another mass shooting in a high school just like this one. And it just, I believe it has to end and something has to be done because it's not okay for people to go to school and other places in public worried about whether or not they'll even go home.
These comments struck a chord with me. I often chafe at superficial analysis around the differences between millennials like myself and Generation Z. We've actually got plenty in common, particularly with how traumatic events shaped our perception about government and politics. We watched in horror as 2 shooters at Columbine High School made us feel vulnerable and unsafe. And we saw how the 9/11 attacks and the Great Recession in 2008 shattered the facade of a post-Cold War life without war or hardship. But there is a huge difference between coming of age as a millennial and as a member of Generation Z. While we could cope with the world changing around us through our familial and social networks, students like Reagan spent the first part of her teenage years wading through a deadly pandemic in relative isolation and in a highly contentious political environment.
I think it's sort of a marker of before COVID and after COVID and how people in our country sort of deal with politics and the way in which people react to hearing differing opinions and having these issues and sort of having everything be so politicized in things that necessarily, quite frankly, don't need to be.
I floated the theory that the students' relief over Biden's decision to exit the presidential race may be based on something less tangible than a specific problem or issue. Biden and Trump served throughout the entirety of the COVID-19 pandemic, and their continued presence in American politics is, for better or for worse, a reminder of how these last few years have been ugly, divisive, sorrowful, and isolating. This is not a perfect theory. Harris is, after all, Biden's vice president, and there's polling suggesting that Trump may win support from younger voters, particularly younger men. But Alyssa in particular says that regardless of the outcome in November, the political environment in America needs to change from where it's been.
People are definitely afraid of what will happen in this election because they are scared of how people will act based on who wins and who loses. And I think that it would be a good thing if we could kind of move past that and be able to agree to disagree.
That's Alyssa Harris, a senior at MICDS who, along with her classmates Zach Kravonek, Reagan Hamilton, and Claire Jokist, talked with me about their thoughts on the election and the state of American politics. And now to our next conversation. One of the first lessons that our kids learn in social studies class is how Americans chose a much different type of executive leadership than European countries. Instead of kings and queens, Americans elect presidents, mayors, and governors. But that doesn't mean that hereditary impulses are completely absent from our elections or our government. In Missouri alone, there are countless examples of sons, daughters, or spouses of elected officials running for office in their own right. And while some voters may be repelled by political dynasties, State Senator Jason Bean of Dunklin County says watching his dad serve in the Missouri House helped him become a better legislator.
One of the things I think that was so important with my dad is he represented his district. And, once again, very Democratic district, one of the poorest districts in the state of Missouri. And I watched him represent his people.
But there is another type of familial political involvement that's not only frowned upon, it's straight up not allowed. Public officials hiring relatives for paid government jobs. Recently, St. Louis County Councilman Dennis Hancock, a Republican from Fenton, faced a lot of scrutiny after he sought to hire his stepdaughter as his assistant. That's not allowed by the Missouri Constitution, and even Hancock conceded he made a mistake.
I trust her, and she's capable, and she has all the requisite qualifications. It was just, my mistake was I didn't realize that nepotism was at play there.
So, do familial ties in politics make for better elected officials, or is it a source of enrichment and corruption? Joining us now to delve into this subject further is Cassandra Good, an associate professor at Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia. Good is the author of the 2023 book, First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. It's an in-depth look at how Washington's step-grandchildren used the first president's name to advance themselves in not-so-good ways. Welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks very much for having me.
Generational service in government and politics seems to be pretty common in the modern era in America. Was it considered normal in the earliest parts of American history?
Yes, certainly from even when America was colonies of Great Britain, there were a lot of family ties of people who were serving in offices. And then from the time that it became an independent country, there have been a lot of family ties among people in elected office, appointed office. If we think about even John Adams and John Quincy Adams, two of our early presidents were father and son. So this really goes back to the beginnings of the nation.
When John Quincy Adams ran for president after John Adams had served, from any research that you've done, How did Americans react to the possibility of having the child of a former president become president?
So most of the objections around John Quincy Adams were centered more around the idea that he was too much of an elite. It wasn't necessarily about critiques of the fact that this is a former president's son. I'm sure that there were some people bringing that up, but the real critique, especially when he was running in 1828 against Andrew Jackson, is this guy is an elitist, and even saying, and his wife is British. His wife was born in England but was American. And so those were more along the lines of the critiques. I think it helped that John Quincy Adams had a very long political career before he ran for president. So it's not like he had never done anything and just is trading on his father's name. He already had like 3 decades of government service before he became president.
In terms of the presidential level, in addition to John Adams and John Quincy Adams, America elected both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, and there's also been a grandfather-grandson combo with William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison. But obviously, familial ties to politics often happens at a lower level than just the presidency. How common was it, especially in the early part of American history, for the son, daughter, spouse of like a mayor or congressperson to try and run and succeed the person that was in office?
Well, certainly in early America, we're not going to have daughters or wives.
It's a very good point, but continue.
Office. So you're not going to have that. But I think, even if you look at state legislatures, if you look at judges, all sorts of positions. And it's not just that this is, I can run for office because a family member has been in office. You have people that are socialized into political life. They're growing up in a family where if their parent is a political figure, they know other political figures, they know how the system works. So they have that particular political capital that they have built up just being in a political family, in addition to the name recognition and the connections. So I think it's natural that that would happen. The real difference is with appointed positions where somebody is appointing a family member to a position, and that was seen as something inappropriate and corrupt in early America.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. Has it always been the case that an elected official appointing their relative to some governmental position has always been associated with corruption?
I would say it's even broader than that. The idea of appointing somebody that you were friends with or had other special connections with was even seen as corrupt in this period. Now, it happened, at least those patronage appointments of, a friend is writing and saying, can you help me get a job, or can you help a friend get a position? And it might be something like a lighthouse keeper, basically a small patronage position. It might be ambassador to another country. That was pretty common. But in terms of appointing family members to positions, so that more strict definition of nepotism, that was something that people really worried even more about and was not as common. And so we see with George Washington, both friends and even his nephew are writing to him when he becomes president to say, hey, do you think you could appoint me to this position? And he over and over again says, that would look bad. People are going to be watching me closely, and I cannot even have the appearance of corruption.
But according to your book, some of his step-grandchildren definitely tried to profit off of the fact that they were tangentially related to the first president of the United States. Can you talk a little bit about that and how I guess this was the first big example of relatives trying to use a famous president to their advantage?
Absolutely. So his step-grandchildren, and just to explain who they are, because most people think of, George Washington, father of the country, didn't have any children. His wife, Martha, had been married before and had 2 kids from that marriage. And her son then had 4 children. So those are the step-grandchildren. And the Washingtons actually sort of unofficially adopted the 2 younger ones. But all 4 of them were raised with George and Martha Washington. And their last name is Custis. So the Custis grandkids, 3 of the 4 were girls, so they couldn't run for office. I think it seems entirely possible that if they could have, they would have. But they are able to benefit in other ways. There's other forms of power through, just having connections to important people in power. They had influence in that way. They had a lot of social clout. And so they still got political and social power from that relationship. And they are just constantly reminding people that George Washington was their adopted father and giving away things that George Washington had given them or that came from Mount Vernon, just to remind people over and over again of that Washington family tie. So they are famous, they are celebrities for being George Washington's children. And that really makes sort of careers for all four of them.
One of the other trends I've noticed is that there are some children of presidents that end up serving in cabinet-level capacities after their father's tenure in office elapsed. So a good example of this is Abraham Lincoln's son serving as Secretary of War under Presidents Garfield and Arthur, or James Garfield's son serving as Secretary of the Interior under President Roosevelt. But Lincoln and Garfield were both deceased by the time those sons became cabinet members. So it's not like their direct influence allowed these two people to get their jobs. How do you think situations like that happen where they're obviously related to a former president, but the president himself is just obviously can't exert any influence because the president is deceased?
Part of it there is just name recognition. And what I was saying before about being socialized into the political scene, that these are people that naturally are going to know more about politics, be more inclined perhaps towards a political career, and have connections. So I think it is, in a sense, not just about favoritism, but that these people actually may know more from having been raised in this setting about politics and be more inclined to it than people who are not related to politicians. And, if we look at early American history in particular, there's a pretty small elite population at that point. And it is largely elite people who are serving in politics. So you're going to have, it's kind of natural at that point that you're going to have some people with family connections that over generations are staying in power just because of the small set of elites at the beginning.
I'm curious, given that one of the basic things that children learn in American history class is that America adopted an executive leadership style that was markedly different than European leadership, i.e. they elected presidents instead of having kings and queens. Was there any general revulsion to the idea that family members should have generational legacies in politics because they wanted to continue to reject what happened in European countries? Or was that not really a factor in...
Well, it's certainly a factor with George Washington because when it becomes clear he's going to be the first president, there's actually a newspaper article in 1788 that had a list of all the reasons he's a good person to be the first president. And one of the items on that list is as having no son and therefore not exposing us to the danger of an hereditary successor. So this idea, this fear about a king and hereditary power, people feel better about the fact that George Washington may have nephews and this adopted grandson, but he doesn't have a direct heir. And in fact, Washington also mentions this in a draft of his first inaugural address, that he doesn't have a son who could take power after him.
So let's flash forward to present day. Missouri's Constitution states as follows: any public officer or employee in this state who by virtue of his office or employment names or appoints to public office or employment any relative within the fourth degree by consanguinity or affinity shall thereby forfeit his office or employment. Now, I understand you probably have not intensely studied every anti-nepotism statute throughout the entire country, but from what I just read, is that a pretty common thing in other states, or are there states with no such direct prohibition on directly appointing a relative to a paid governmental position?
It's interesting. Each state determines this on its own. There's nothing in the Constitution about this. And so some states like Missouri have rules on this. They have various, you mentioned any relative within the fourth degree, and consanguinity, that's the blood relation or affinity by marriage. And so some of them will have different degrees of relationship. They also have different levels of penalties. So in Alabama, for example, it is a misdemeanor to do this that could be punished by anywhere from a $500 fine to imprisonment for a year. So there's variation within these laws. And then there are many states that have no provisions at all on nepotism. They do have general conflict of interest laws, but the state where I live, Virginia, has no such law. California, Delaware, Illinois, none of those states have laws on the books specifically about nepotism.
So just to put forth a hypothetical, if Governor Glenn Youngkin wanted to appoint his son to a paid governmental position within his staff, there's nothing within Virginia law that would punish him or prevent him from doing that.
There's not a specific statute. I don't know if people would try to use some kind of conflict of interest statutes, but I mean, we can even see in the last presidential administration when President Trump appointed his daughter and son-in-law to positions in the White House as advisors, there was some debate over whether that was legal or not. There is a federal anti-nepotism statute from 1967 that's in part a reaction to when John F. Kennedy appointed his brother Robert as Attorney General. But that statute has been interpreted as not including either the president or the executive office. So certainly there's, even when laws are on the books, there is room for interpretation. And I do think in many states that would be legally just fine to do.
Yeah, you mentioned John F. Kennedy appointing Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General, which I was not alive then. I was negative 30 years old when that occurred. But I do know from reading in history that was not universally beloved as a move. And nepotism was brought up. And I think that even Robert F. Kennedy knew that that was going to be a mark against him. He still got confirmed. He was Attorney General. Was there any other instances where like a president like tried to appoint like a brother or a son like that? Or was that really unprecedented in presidential history from what you've researched?
I have not come across other examples of that happening. It may well have. This is clearly a high enough profile one that it caused Congress to take action. But Congress also was worried about the fact that at the time, plenty of congressmen had family members working in their congressional offices as well, which is now barred by that law. Although there is a workaround on that too, which is quite common, and that is that many Congress people have family members working on their campaign staff.
Which actually is a case in St. Louis. Congresswoman Cori Bush engendered some controversy because she employed her husband to do security work for her, but he was paid by the campaign. But that wasn't actually that unusual. Like Lacey Clay, the congressman that Cori Bush defeated, paid his sister to basically run all of his campaigns over the years. And Russ Carnahan, who was also a former congressman, had his wife on as an advisory role. My understanding is that's allowed as long as you're paying fair market value to the person and the person's actually doing work, i.e. you can't pay your husband $3 million to like write a speech for you. It has to be comparable to what you pay a speechwriter, from my understanding.
Yes, that's correct. And congressmen actually have to sort of sign something certifying that they are not employing any family members in their offices. But again, the campaign is a separate money source from the federal positions.
There is also another workaround to anti-nepotism statutes, getting some other elected official to hire your son, daughter, spouse in their county, state, federal position. Was that a common? Obviously, I don't know if there were like specific anti-nepotism statutes in like the early 1800s or even the 1900s, but that seems like that seems like something that is probably very hard to combat. Even if you have an elected official asking another elected official to hire somebody. What about that as a workaround to some of the anti-nepotism provisions that we've talked about?
Well, and that could fall more under the sort of patronage heading that I mentioned before, that Americans in early America did think of as being corrupt. That if you were petitioning an elected official to appoint somebody else related to you or a friend of yours, that's still considered improper, but it was not illegal. And most of these anti-nepotism laws were not on the books in early America. And, one early example I can think of here is if we go back to George Washington, his nephew, Bushrod Washington, had asked George Washington for an appointment as a district attorney. And that's where George Washington said, no, I can't do that. It would look bad. But after Washington retired under the next president, John Adams, Bushrod Washington was appointed to the Supreme Court as a Supreme Court justice. And we might look at that and say, oh, that looks bad. But in fact, it doesn't seem that George Washington was involved in that appointment. And Bushrod Washington wrote a letter to George Washington apologizing basically for taking that position because he knew that George actually wanted him to run for Congress. And at the time, being a Supreme Court justice was not very prestigious. So we have this example here. This is, under President John Adams, but in fact, while it might look like nepotism, it does not appear to have been.
So we've talked a lot about the drawbacks of having family members participate in the political and governmental process. Have you found that there are any benefits to the general public, not necessarily to the family members themselves, of having sort of these familial ties either in elected offices or appointed offices?
Well, I think that if you're looking for people who understand how the political system works and have some experience with the system, then that could be seen as a benefit. Many voters now want to vote for people that have nothing to do with the system. That can also be seen as a negative because how will they know how to navigate it? On the other hand, they could bring different ideas. So it's partially a matter of perspective there and also a matter of whether that family member actually is qualified. So if we go back to the John Quincy Adams example, this is somebody who not only had grown up around politics, had been in many, many different positions throughout his career before he was elected president. And so he's clearly qualified in addition to having that family background. And so I think when those things go together, it can be a benefit because of having that knowledge. But again, it's partially a matter of perspective.
One of the things that I read, particularly about John F. Kennedy's appointment of Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General, is JFK believed that RFK would give him unfiltered, honest counsel that may not have been possible with somebody who was not related to him. And I just finished up a book about RFK's recounting of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which he was a major part of. And I think that I don't know if John F. Kennedy has written or spoke about this aspect of that crisis, but I think it was probably comforting to John F. Kennedy to have Robert F. Kennedy in the trenches with him during that extremely pivotal moment in history. What do you think about that phenomenon, that having a relative, admittingly in a usual situation like a presidential cabinet, could make decision-making more fluid and more honest?
I would say that to me would be outweighed by the fact that you would worry about whether that person could be fully honest or critical of a family member. Anybody who appoints you can also dismiss you and has some power over you. And in a family relationship, I think that adds another layer of complication. And so while there might be more trust and comfort, there's also a question of transparency. How much honesty are you actually going to get from that person? And will they be willing to disagree with you if they need to?
Cassandra Good is an associate professor at Marymount University and the author of First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wissentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich, and our production intern is Roche Hemmings.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.